Hey guys, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in and welcome to my little studio. Please sit down with me and we'll talk about sound engineering and mixing and arrangement and music production. Today, let's talk about this track that seems to have way too many Pro Q3s on it. If I look at my mixes, it always seems like I always end up with one or two tracks that have a lot of Pro Q3 instances on them, and they're all sidechained, and I want to show you why it's so. When I am doing production work, sometimes I feel the need to have a big instrument that takes a big space of the audio spectrum just to make the sound bigger and wider. And more often than not, my choice for that would be an emulation of a Roland Juno synth. My weapon of choice is the soft tube version. But there are many that are just as good and do the same thing. The great thing about the Juno sound is that it's big, it's rich, and it fills up all the gaps in the mix. The bad thing about the Juno sound is that it's big, it's rich, and it fills up all the gaps in the mix. It's a big sound to manage, and sometimes it creates a lot of clashing and masking just because it's so big and in your face. In the case of this song, this is the sound. I like to think of the Juno as the electric guitar of modern production. It's this big sound that creates grit in the mid-range and then has this very, very exciting high mids and highs, and it creates all of this swoosh of sound and excitement that fills up the spectrum. Obviously, it's a very, very bulky sound that needs to be controlled, and just EQing it is not enough. In the case of this song, I have a few synth elements that happen here and there, and obviously I want them to come to the forefront. Let me give you an example. In this section of the song, you have the vocal chops competing for space in the mid-range. Now, instead of EQing out the frequencies of the vocal chops from the big synth, I stick in a Pro Q3 like this, and as you can see, I've set up a dynamic EQ round about where the vocal chops are happening. Another thing that I've done, I made the vocal chops mono and put them in the middle, so I do not need to compress the sides of the synth for this. So I created a mono dynamic EQ in the middle, and then I sidechained it to the vocal chops. See, that way, every time the vocal chops happen, that specific frequency of the big synth gets squashed down and you can hear the chops clearly. Now, this is fun. The bass in the song is a layer. I have a sub bass that fills up all the lowest part of the mix, and it's mono and central. And then I have the organ bass that's put on top of it, and it's stereo without a center, just to give width to the bass sound. And it's also a lot of sound, and the organ bass is one of the main sounds of the song because it recalls, classic house music from the 90s. So I need to make sure that when the big synth comes in, it doesn't smother the bass and makes it unfocused. So what I've done, I have created another instance of Pro Q3 on the big synth, and I have made two EQ nodes on it and made them dynamic and sidechained. The first one is placed on the mid portion of the sound, so just the center of the stereo field, because it takes care only of the frequencies of the sub bass. You can see it's a low shelf, and every time the bass triggers it, it squashes down just that part of the sound, which is under 275. Now, 275 is also the crossover point where the sound of the organ bass is. the organ is a very wide sound, so there's none of it in the middle. So I created an EQ node on the sides. I made it dynamic, and then I sidechained it to the bass. So every time the bass sounds, you have a low shelf squashing the mid, and the other dynamic EQ squashing just the sides. And this is what it sounds like. By now you should have understood the name of the game, which is finding out where the frequencies of the competing instrument is and where it is placed on the stereo field, and sidechain a Pro Q3 instance with dynamic EQ node just on the side and the frequency where you want the sound to squash. Here's another example, and this is very important because it's the vocals. The area around 200, 300 is very important for anything, but for vocals especially, because it's more or less, especially if you have a female singer, where the fundamental of the sound is, but also it's where rambling happens. So if you want to clean up the lower mids and make the sound intelligible, you have to really manage that area. And in my case, what I do, I figure out where the fundamental and the first bunch of harmonics are in the vocals, and then put a Pro Q3 sidechained all in the middle, because the vocals are monoring in the middle in this case, and then make sure that every time the vocals happen, the big synth sound gets squashed down.
Give me more, and give me time.
Now, if I bypass it, you'll hear that the vocals get farther away.
Give me more, and give me time. Give me time.
See, as soon as I activated this instance of Pro Q3, the vocals jumped out, whereas before, when it was bypassed, they sounded slightly more muffled and with this build-up in the lower mids. Now, this is definitely a fun one. There is this specific piano sound that comes from classic house music in the 90s, and it was the Korg M1 piano. And it had that very pointy sound with a lot of attack. And when you hear it, you know it right away. And it's not just the sound, it's also the rhythmic figure that is playing. It's this one. Well, that takes me back. Anyway, I put the piano on the left-hand side. So I created two nodes in Pro Q3 and put them on the left side of the spectrum, and made sure that they are sidechained to the house piano, so that now, when it plays, you can actually hear it coming out of the left speaker. See, it really makes a big difference. Almost at the end of the mix, I realized that the vocal chops were not coming through as clearly as I wanted them to. So instead of going back to my first Pro Q3 and just made the compression action deeper, I created another Pro Q3. I dialed in a much smaller compression action with a tiny bit more compression on the high mids. This is like daisy chaining compressors, where you can use more compressors to have a gentler action on it. And this is what it sounds like. Well, anyway, this is all for today. Thanks for spending some time with me. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think of this. Let me know if it works for you. Let me know if it doesn't work for you. In the meantime, have a good day and be excellent to each other. Thanks for watching again.